The carriage lamp flickered once and went dark, and in that single breath of blackness, Alina Ashford felt the wheel beneath her drop into nothing. Rain had been falling since noon, but by nightfall it had turned into something else, something with teeth. The road along the cliffs had always been dangerous in a storm, and the driver, a young man named Peter who had worked for the Ashford family for barely a year, gripped the reins with both hands as the horses screamed and reared. Alina's maid, a gentle woman named Clara who had cared for her since her wedding day, grabbed Alina's arm and shouted something that the wind swallowed whole. Alina did not know in that moment that her life was about to be cut cleanly into two halves, a before and an after. She only knew fear, sharp and cold, rising in her chest as the carriage tilted. 3 years earlier, Alina had walked down the long aisle of Ashford Hall's private chapel believing that love could be built slowly, like a house, one stone at a time. She had been 22, hopeful and quietly determined to be a good wife to a man she barely knew. Alexander Ashford was handsome in the careless way of men who had never had to try, and he had smiled at her on their wedding day with a warmth that made her believe, for a while, that he might grow to love her. He did not. Alexander's family had been drowning in debt for a decade before Alina arrived. Ashford Hall, with its high ceilings and cold stone corridors, needed roofs repaired and staff paid and land reclaimed from creditors who circled like patient birds. Alina's father had money, the kind of money that came from trade rather than titles, and Alexander needed exactly that. Their marriage had been arranged over dinners and letters, sealed with polite smiles, and Alina had told herself that many marriages began this way and grew into something real. For the first year she tried. She learned the names of every servant in the house, from the youngest kitchen girl to the oldest groundskeeper. She sat for hours with Alexander's mother, Margaret, a sharp-tongued but lonely woman who had outlived her husband, and watched her son grow distant and cold. Alina nursed Margaret through a long illness that winter, sitting by her bed through the darkest hours, reading to her when she could not sleep. Margaret, in turn, grew to love Alina as the daughter she never had, and often told her so in quiet, private moments. Alexander noticed none of it. He spent his evenings at his club in the city, and increasingly his evenings elsewhere. Alina first heard the name Vivienne Sinclair from a housemaid who did not realize she was listening. Lady Vivienne was a widow, beautiful and clever, with a reputation for charm that opened doors most women could not even find. She had known Alexander since childhood, long before Alina had ever set foot in Ashford Hall, and the servants whispered that some old flame between them had never truly gone out. Alina did not confront him. She had learned in 3 years of marriage that confrontation only made Alexander colder, more distant, more likely to disappear for days at a time. So instead she watched quietly, the way a person watches weather gathering on the horizon, knowing a storm is coming but unable to stop it. By the 3rd year, the whispers had grown louder. Alexander and Vivienne were seen together at the opera. They were seen together at dinner parties where Alina had not been invited. A groundsman mentioned, without thinking, that a carriage bearing Lady Vivienne's crest had been seen leaving Ashford Hall late at night, more than once, while Alina slept in a room down the corridor from her husband's. Alina began to feel like a ghost in her own home. She managed the estate books. She organized the harvest. She made sure the tenants were paid fairly and the roof over the east wing no longer leaked. She did everything a good duchess should do, and her husband barely looked at her across the dinner table. It was Margaret, in the end, who suggested the trip. "Go to the coast house," the old woman said one afternoon, her hands folded over a blanket in her lap. "The sea air will do you good, child, and perhaps some distance will remind my son what he has been neglecting." Alina had smiled, though she did not believe distance would change anything. Still, the thought of the coast house, quiet and simple, far from the tension of Ashford Hall, felt like a small mercy. She packed a single trunk, arranged for Clara to travel with her, and set out on a gray morning under skies that promised nothing good. She did not know, as the carriage rolled down the long drive, and Alexander did not come to the window to wave, that she would never see Ashford Hall the same way again. The first day of travel was calm enough. They stopped at a small inn along the road, ate a quiet supper, and Alina spent the evening writing in a journal she had kept since girlhood, filling pages with thoughts she could share with no one else. She wrote about her loneliness. She wrote about Margaret's kindness. She did not write about Vivienne because writing her name felt like giving her power. The second day brought the storm. It began as a light drizzle in the morning, the kind that barely dampened the road, but by mid-afternoon the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the wind picked up until the trees along the cliff road bent low and groaned. Peter, the driver, wanted to stop at the next village and wait out the weather, but Alina, eager to reach the coast house before dark, insisted they press on. It was a decision she would think about for the rest of her life. The road narrowed as it climbed along the cliffs, with the sea crashing far below on one side and jagged rock rising on the other. Rain turned the packed earth to mud, and the wheels of the carriage began to slip. Clara held tightly to the strap above the window, her knuckles white, while Alina pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and watched the world blur into gray streaks. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment the whole cliffside was lit up bright as day. In that flash, Alina saw the road ahead had crumbled, a section washed away by the relentless rain, leaving a gap where solid ground should have been. She opened her mouth to shout a warning, but the horses had already seen it, and the carriage lurched violently to the side. What followed happened too fast for thought. The world tilted. Clara's scream tore through the noise of the storm. Wood cracked. The carriage rolled once, twice, and Alina felt herself thrown against the door. Then the roof. Then nothing at all as the vehicle broke apart around her, and the cold, furious river below rose up to meet her. Water closed over her head, dark and freezing, and for a long, terrible moment, Alina Ashford did not know which way was up. She fought against the current with everything she had, her lungs burning, her gown heavy and dragging her down like hands pulling her into the deep. Somewhere in the chaos, she lost sight of Clara entirely. She tried to call out, but the river filled her mouth instead of air, and the current pulled her further from the wreckage, spinning her through the dark water until she no longer knew which direction led to the surface and which led to the bottom of the river. Just when her strength began to fail, her hand struck something solid. A fallen tree branch caught against the rocks near the riverbank. She grabbed it with the last of her will and pulled herself toward it, coughing up water, gasping for breath that felt like fire in her chest. The rain still poured down, relentless, and the world around her was nothing but darkness and noise and pain. She did not remember climbing onto the bank. She did not remember crawling through the mud, away from the roaring water, until her body simply gave out beneath her and everything went black. When Alina opened her eyes again, she was lying on a narrow bed in a room she did not recognize, with a fire crackling in a small stone hearth and the smell of drying herbs hanging in the air. An older woman sat in a chair beside the bed, knitting quietly, her face lined with the kind of weather-beaten wisdom that came from a lifetime near the sea. "You're awake," the woman said, setting down her needles. "Good, I was starting to wonder." Alina tried to speak, but her throat was raw and no words came. The woman poured a cup of warm broth and helped her sip it slowly. "My name is Margaret," the woman said, and something in Alina flinched at the name, though she could not remember why. "My husband found you on the riverbank 2 days ago, more dead than alive. You've had a fever since. Do you remember your name, dear?" Alina opened her mouth to answer, and found, to her own quiet horror, that she could not. The days that followed blurred together in a strange fog. The fisherman's widow, whose name truly was Margaret, though a different Margaret from the one Alina had left behind, cared for her patiently, feeding her broth and changing the bandage on the wound at her temple, a deep cut that had likely come from striking rock or wood during the wreck. Alina's body slowly healed, but her memory returned in pieces, scattered and unclear, like fragments of a shattered mirror. She remembered rain first, then the sound of Clara's scream. Then, slowly, over the course of nearly a week, her own name returned to her, followed by flashes of Ashford Hall, of Margaret Ashford's kind, aging face, of a wedding day filled with hope that had slowly curdled into loneliness. She did not, at first, remember Alexander's coldness, or Vivienne's name, or the quiet grief that had settled into her chest over 3 years of marriage. Those memories came last, and when they did, they brought with them a strange and unexpected clarity, as though the accident had washed away not just her memory but some of the fear that had kept her silent for so long. The fisherman, a weathered man named Edmund, had found her half-drowned on the riverbank 2 miles downstream from the wreck, tangled in reeds and barely breathing. He had carried her the rest of the way to his cottage himself, though he was well past 60, and the walk had left him gasping for breath. "Storm like that comes maybe once in 10 years, Edmund told her one evening, as she sat wrapped in blankets near the fire, her strength slowly returning. "Whole road along the cliff gave way in 3 places. Village folk have been talking about it all week." "Has anyone spoken of a carriage accident?" Elinor asked, her voice still weak. "A young woman traveling with a maid." Edmund's face grew somber, and he glanced at his wife before answering. "Aye." Word came from the next village over. A carriage went into the river that night. They found the wreckage. Found a young woman's body too, tangled in the wreck, wearing a fine traveling cloak. Terrible thing. Elinor's blood ran cold. A young woman's body. "They say it was the Duchess of Ashford herself," Edmund said, shaking his head slowly. "Terrible thing. They held a service just this week, from what I hear. Whole county is talking about it." Elinor sat very still, the fire crackling beside her, as the truth settled over her like a stone dropped into still water. Clara. It had been Clara, wearing Elinor's cloak because the night had turned so cold. Clara, who had borrowed the ring Elinor kept in her travel case because she loved its sapphire stone and had asked, laughing, if she might try it on for the journey. Clara, who had died in that river wearing another woman's identity, while the world believed the Duchess of Ashford had perished. Grief struck Elinor first, sharp and genuine, for the gentle young woman who had served her faithfully and died in her place. She wept that night in the small cottage by the sea, mourning Clara properly, quietly, the way she had not yet been able to mourn anyone in her carefully controlled life. But beneath the grief, something else began to stir, a question cold and clear. If the world believed her dead, what had her husband done in the weeks since? She wrote a letter that very night, her hand shaking as she formed the words, addressed to Ashford Hall, explaining that she had survived, that she was recovering with a fisherman's family along the coast, that she would return home as soon as her strength allowed. She gave the letter to Edmund's grandson, a boy of perhaps 14 who rode a sturdy pony to the next village each week for supplies, and asked him to see it delivered to the nearest post house. The boy promised he would, and Elinor believed him. She did not yet know that the letter would never reach its destination, intercepted by hands far more careful and far more cruel than she could have imagined. She only knew, as she lay awake that night listening to the waves outside the cottage window, that something had shifted inside her, some quiet, patient strength she had never known she possessed. For 3 more weeks, Elinor remained with Edmund and his wife, regaining her strength slowly, walking a little further each day along the rocky shore, breathing the clean salt air and thinking. She thought about the 3 years of her marriage, about every slight and every silence she had endured without complaint. She thought about Margaret Ashford, waiting alone in that cold house, likely grieving a daughter she had never had by blood but had loved as her own. And she thought, with growing frequency, about what kind of man her husband truly was, and what he might be doing now that the world believed his wife was gone. By the time her strength had returned enough to travel, Elinor had made a decision. She would not send word ahead again. She would not risk another letter falling into careless hands. Instead, she would return to Ashford Hall quietly, without warning, and see with her own eyes what had become of her home, and her husband, in the weeks since the world had declared her dead. She thanked Edmund and his wife with every coin she had left in her travel case, promising to send more once she was home, and set out on the long journey back toward Ashford Hall, wearing borrowed clothes and carrying nothing but the clarity that had grown inside her since the night the river had tried to take her life, and instead had given her something far more valuable. The truth. As her hired carriage rolled closer to the county she had once called home, Elinor began to hear things at every stop along the road, in taverns and coach houses and market squares. Fragments of gossip that made her blood run cold and her resolve harden into something unbreakable. The Duke of Ashford, it seemed, had not spent the weeks since his wife's death in mourning. He had spent them planning a ball. The coach house innkeeper had not recognized Elinor, wrapped as she was in a plain traveling cloak that Edmund's wife had given her, her hair pulled back simply instead of styled the way a duchess would wear it. She had become, without meaning to, invisible in a way she had never been before, and she found she could listen to conversations that would never have reached her ears as the Duchess of Ashford. "They say the wedding will be grander than the funeral was," a merchant's wife said to her companion over tea in the corner of the coach house, not troubling to lower her voice. Barely 3 weeks the man waited. 3 weeks, and already he announces a new betrothal. "Lady Vivienne Sinclair," the other woman replied, her tone somewhere between scandal and admiration. "Everyone always said there was something between them, long before the poor Duchess passed. I heard the engagement ball is to be held at Ashford Hall itself, this very week." Elinor sat very still at her small table near the window, her cup of tea growing cold in her hands, as the two women continued their conversation without any idea that the subject of their gossip sat close enough to hear every word. 3 weeks. Her husband had waited 3 weeks to begin courting his betrothal openly, and now he intended to host a ball in the very house where Elinor had nursed his mother through illness, where she had spent 3 years trying to build something real out of an arrangement made from necessity. The grief that had lived in her chest since Clara's death shifted, slowly, into something colder and far more useful. She did not cry, she did not rage. She simply finished her tea, paid for her room for the night, and began to think. The journey to Ashford Hall took 2 more days, and with each mile that passed, Elinor gathered more fragments of information, piecing together the shape of what had happened in her absence. The funeral, she learned, had been small and quiet, held only a week after the accident, before anyone could properly search the river for a second body. The county had mourned briefly, politely, the way people mourn a stranger of high rank, and then life had continued. Alexander, it seemed, had not mourned long at all. Elinor learned, from a stable boy at one of the coach houses who spoke freely to a woman he believed to be a lady's traveling companion, that the Duke of Ashford had been seen at the opera with Lady Vivienne only 2 weeks after the funeral, laughing and smiling in a way that had scandalized half the county. She learned that invitations to the engagement ball had gone out to nearly every noble family within a day's travel, printed on fine paper with gold trim, announcing the joyful news of the Duke's coming marriage. Each piece of information landed like a small stone added to a growing weight inside her chest, but Elinor found, to her own surprise, that the weight did not crush her. Instead, it seemed to steady her, giving her something solid to stand on as the shock of her own survival slowly faded into purpose. She thought often of Margaret, the Duke's mother, and wondered how the old woman had taken the news of her death. Margaret had loved her, truly and fiercely, in the way that lonely people sometimes attach themselves to those who show them genuine kindness. Elinor could not imagine that Margaret had accepted this hasty new engagement with anything but quiet horror, and the thought of the old woman grieving alone in that cold house gave Elinor a new kind of resolve. She would return, not quietly, not through the servant's entrance with a careful explanation prepared in advance. She would return in a way that could not be hidden, could not be explained away, could not be smoothed over by careful words and practiced smiles. She would return on the night of the ball. The decision settled into her with a strange, quiet calm as her hired carriage rolled through the final miles toward the county she had once called home. She thought of Alexander's face when he had married her, hopeful in the careless way of a man who believed everything would simply work out because it always had before. She thought of the years since, the slow erosion of any warmth between them, the whispers she had pretended not to hear, the nights she had spent alone in a grand house full of people who did not truly see her. She thought most of all of the words the merchant's wife had spoken so carelessly in the coach house. 3 weeks. He had waited 3 weeks. By the time Alina reached the small village nearest to Ashford Hall, the ball was only 2 days away, and the entire county seemed to speak of nothing else. She took a room at a modest inn under a false name, telling the innkeeper's wife that she was a distant relation traveling to attend a family wedding nearby, a lie close enough to the truth that it required little effort to maintain. She spent those 2 days quietly, resting, gathering her strength, and making careful arrangements. She sent word, through a trusted messenger she paid generously for his discretion, to Margaret Ashford directly, though she instructed the boy to place the letter in the old woman's hands alone, with no other servant present. She could not risk the letter falling into the wrong hands again, not when she was so close to the truth finally being revealed. The letter said only this: "I am alive, I will come to you soon. Trust no one else with this news until I arrive." She did not know, as she sealed the letter and sent the boy on his way, whether it would reach Margaret safely, or whether some careless servant loyal to the wrong master might intercept it as her first letter had been intercepted. She could only hope, and hope had become, in these strange weeks since the accident, a stranger and more fragile thing than she had ever known it to be. On the morning of the ball, Alina rose before dawn and walked along the quiet village road, breathing the cool morning air, watching the mist rise slowly off the fields that surrounded Ashford Hall in the distance. She could see the great house from here, its stone walls pale against the gray morning sky, its many windows dark and still, waiting for the evening when they would blaze with candlelight and welcome the county's finest families to celebrate a betrothal built on a lie. She thought of Clara, buried now in the small churchyard near Ashford Hall under a headstone that bore Alina's own name, and felt a fresh wave of grief and anger rise together in her chest. Clara deserved better than to be forgotten, buried under a false name, while the man responsible for so much of Alina's unhappiness prepared to celebrate a new engagement in the very house where Clara had served faithfully for years. Alina made a quiet promise to herself, standing alone on that misty road, that she would see the truth told properly, no matter what it cost her. She spent the rest of the day preparing carefully. She had brought, hidden in the bottom of her travel case since the accident, a single fine gown that Edmund's wife had helped her mend and clean after the wreck had ruined most of her belongings, a deep blue silk that Alina had once worn to a dinner at Ashford Hall in happier days, back when she had still believed her marriage might grow into something real. It had survived the river better than she had expected, and now it seemed almost fitting that she should wear it again, on this night of all nights. She arranged her hair simply but elegantly, the way she had worn it in the early days of her marriage, before she had learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable in her own home. She examined the thin scar at her temple in the small mirror above the washstand, a permanent reminder of the night the river had nearly claimed her life, and decided she would not hide it beneath her hair. Let them see it. Let them understand what she had survived. As evening approached, and the sky over the village began to turn shades of orange and purple, Alina hired a small, plain carriage, the kind that would draw no attention among the grand vehicles already making their way toward Ashford Hall. She wrapped herself in a dark traveling cloak, the hood pulled low over her face, and gave the driver quiet instructions to take her to the great house, joining the long line of carriages that had already begun to form along the drive. Through the small carriage window, she watched Ashford Hall grow larger and larger as they approached, every window blazing with candlelight, music already drifting faintly across the grounds, the sound of laughter and conversation carrying on the evening air. Servants in fine livery moved among the arriving guests, taking cloaks and directing carriages, and Alina felt her heart pounding steadily in her chest as her own carriage joined the slow procession toward the entrance. She thought in that final quiet moment before she stepped down onto the graveled drive of the home she had once called her own, of every silence she had endured, every slight she had swallowed, every night she had spent alone while her husband's heart belonged elsewhere. She thought of Clara and of Margaret, and of the letter she had sent that morning, praying it had reached the right hands. And she thought with a calm that surprised even herself that whatever happened tonight, she would not be silent any longer. The carriage rolled to a stop. A footman opened the door and offered his hand to help her down, his eyes passing over her without recognition, seeing only another guest arriving for the celebration. Eleanor took his hand, stepped down onto the gravel, and looked up at the glowing windows of Ashford Hall, filled with the light and laughter of a party celebrating her own supposed death. She kept her hood raised as she moved through the crowd gathering near the entrance, slipping past familiar faces who did not recognize her in the dim evening light, her heart steady now, her purpose clear. She had crossed a river that should have killed her. She had walked for miles along storm-battered roads with no memory of her own name. She had listened to strangers speak of her own funeral without knowing they spoke to the woman herself. She could certainly walk through the doors of her own home. The great doors of Ashford Hall stood open, golden light spilling out onto the drive, and the sound of a string quartet drifted from the ballroom within, mixing with the low hum of hundreds of voices. The county's finest families gathered together to witness the announcement of a new betrothal. Eleanor paused at the threshold for only a moment, drawing a steady breath, before stepping inside. The entrance hall, familiar in every detail, from the tall mirrors to the curved staircase she had climbed 1,000 times, seemed almost foreign to her now, as though she were viewing it through the eyes of a stranger. Guests moved past her in fine silks and polished shoes, none of them sparing more than a passing glance at the cloaked woman near the door. She moved through the crowd slowly, deliberately, making her way toward the ballroom where the music grew louder. The light grew brighter, and somewhere ahead, she knew, her husband stood beside another woman, preparing to announce a future he believed was entirely his own to claim. Eleanor reached the edge of the ballroom, remained in the shadow of a great marble pillar, and lowered her hood just enough to see clearly, without yet being seen. And there, standing at the center of the glittering room, raising a glass of champagne toward a crowd that hung on his every word, stood Alexander Ashford, smiling in a way Eleanor had not seen in years, with Lady Vivienne Sinclair glowing at his side. The ballroom of Ashford Hall had been transformed since Eleanor last stood within its walls. Fresh flowers, white and gold, climbed the pillars in careful arrangements that must have cost a fortune to assemble on short notice. Hundreds of candles burned in the great chandeliers overhead, their light catching on crystal glasses and jeweled necklaces until the whole room seemed to shimmer. The string quartet in the corner played something light and joyful, entirely unaware that they provided the music for a celebration built on a foundation of deception. Eleanor stood very still behind the marble pillar, watching her husband address the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the world would arrange itself around his wishes. Beside him, Lady Vivienne Sinclair wore a gown of deep emerald silk that seemed designed to draw every eye in the room, her dark hair styled elaborately, a triumphant smile fixed upon her lips. "My friends," Alexander began, raising his glass higher as the room quieted around him, "I know this gathering comes sooner than some of you might have expected, given the sorrow our family has so recently endured." A murmur rippled through the crowd, polite and sympathetic, the kind of sound people make when they wish to appear moved without actually feeling very much at all. "But life, as we are so often reminded, does not pause for grief," Alexander continued, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, practiced and smooth. "As you know, I tragically lost my beloved wife not many weeks ago, in an accident that shook this entire household to its core." Eleanor's fingers curled tightly around the edge of her cloak, her nails pressing into her palm through the fabric. She watched him speak of her loss with such practiced sorrow, such carefully arranged grief, as though he had rehearsed the words in front of a mirror until they sounded convincing. "Yet even in the depths of sorrow, I have found that life demands we move forward," he said, and here he turned, taking Vivienne's hand in his own, lifting it gently to his lips before the assembled crowd. "And I have found in an old and dear friend, a companion who has helped me remember that joy is still possible, even after loss." The crowd erupted into polite applause, though Alina caught more than a few raised eyebrows among the older guests, more than a few whispered comments hidden behind fans and gloved hands. Not everyone in the room believed in the sincerity of Alexander's grief, it seemed, though none appeared willing to say so aloud. "Tonight," Alexander continued, his smile widening as Vivienne gazed up at him with an expression of practiced adoration, "I am honored to announce my engagement to Lady Vivienne Sinclair. We shall be married before the autumn ends." The applause grew louder, mixed now with genuine excitement from those who had long anticipated this match, and somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice called out a toast to the happy couple, and glasses rose throughout the ballroom in a glittering wave of crystal and candlelight. Alina felt something inside her chest crack, not with grief this time, but with a clarity so sharp it nearly took her breath away. She thought of every year she had spent trying to earn a place in this man's heart, every quiet sacrifice she had made without complaint, every lonely evening spent waiting for a husband who had already given his affection to someone else long before Alina had ever walked into this house. She thought of the coach house merchant's wife, speaking so casually of a betrothal announced barely 3 weeks after a funeral. She thought of Clara, buried under Alina's own name in the churchyard, while the man who should have been mourning his wife instead raised a glass to his future bride in the very room where his marriage vows had once been spoken. She thought, too, of something colder and more practical, a thought that had been growing in the back of her mind since the coach house conversation she had overheard. Her father's fortune, settled upon her at marriage, would have transferred entirely to Alexander upon her death, as was customary in such arrangements. A dead wife meant not only freedom to remarry, but freedom to claim every coin that had once been Alina's own. Had he known, somehow, that the carriage would never reach the coast house? Had he simply seized an opportunity that fate had handed him, moving with unseemly haste the moment word reached him of the accident? Alina did not yet know the answer, but the question settled into her like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every certainty she had once held about the man she had married. She thought of Margaret, too, wondering whether the old woman stood somewhere in this glittering crowd, forced to smile through an engagement she surely could not have welcomed, having loved Alina as her own daughter. Alina scanned the edges of the ballroom, searching the sea of unfamiliar faces for the one face she hoped might still recognize her, but the crowd was too thick, the candlelight too uneven, to make out any single figure clearly from where she stood. The quartet began to play again, a lively piece meant to invite dancing, and couples began moving toward the center of the floor, laughing and chattering as the formal announcement gave way to the easy pleasure of celebration. Alexander led Vivienne onto the dance floor himself, his hand resting at her waist with a familiarity that told Alina everything she needed to know about how long this arrangement had truly been in the making. Alina watched them turn slowly across the polished floor, the candlelight catching Vivienne's emerald gown, the crowd parting respectfully to give the betrothed couple room to dance. And she felt, for the first time since the carriage had gone over the cliff road, something that was not grief and was not fear, but was instead a quiet, burning resolve. She had survived a river that should have killed her. She had walked for days along unfamiliar roads with no memory of her own name, and slowly, painfully, rebuilt herself piece by piece. She had listened to strangers speak of her own funeral, and swallowed her grief for Clara until she could give it the proper attention it deserved. She had traveled across the county in borrowed clothes, gathering the pieces of a truth her husband clearly believed would never come to light. She would not stand in the shadows a moment longer. Alina reached up slowly and lowered the hood of her cloak entirely, letting it fall back onto her shoulders, revealing her face fully to the candlelight for the first time since she had entered the ballroom. She smoothed the deep blue silk of her gown with steady hands, lifted her chin, and stepped out from behind the marble pillar into the open space at the edge of the dance floor. For a moment no one noticed her at all. The music continued, the dancers turned. The crowd murmured and laughed among themselves, entirely unaware that the woman they believed dead stood among them once again, alive and unharmed, watching the celebration of her own supposed passing with eyes that had grown harder, sharper, and infinitely more determined than the woman who had left Ashford Hall in a carriage weeks before. Then a young woman standing near the edge of the dance floor turned, glanced casually toward Alina, and froze entirely, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering against the polished marble floor. The sound cut through the music like a blade, sharp and sudden, and heads began to turn throughout the ballroom, drawn first by the noise of breaking glass, and then, one by one, by the sight of the woman standing quietly at the edge of the dance floor, her face illuminated by candlelight, a thin pale scar visible at her temple, wearing a gown that several of the older guests recognized immediately from happier evenings years before. The music faltered, the quartet's bow hands slowing uncertainly as the musicians noticed the strange hush spreading through the crowd. Conversations died away in ripples, spreading outward from the shattered glass until the great ballroom, moments before filled with laughter and music, fell into a silence so complete that Alina could hear her own heartbeat pounding steadily in her ears. Alexander, still turning slowly across the dance floor with Vivienne in his arms, seemed to be the last person in the room to notice that something had changed. He laughed at something Vivienne had murmured to him, spun her gently in the final steps of the dance, and only then, as he lifted his gaze to acknowledge the crowd, did he see what every other guest in the ballroom had already seen. His wife, dead for 3 weeks by every account he had given, stood very much alive at the edge of his engagement ball, watching him with an expression he had never once seen on her face in 3 years of marriage. The glass slipped from Alexander's own hand a moment later, joining the first shattered crystal on the marble floor, the sound echoing through a silence so complete that even the candles seemed to hold their flames still, waiting to see what would happen next. For a long moment, nobody in the ballroom moved at all. The candles burned steadily overhead, the flowers along the pillars remained fixed in their careful arrangements, and hundreds of guests stood frozen in place, caught between disbelief and something closer to fear, as though the ordinary rules of the evening had suddenly stopped applying. Alina stood perfectly still at the edge of the dance floor, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed steadily on her husband, who had gone pale as candle wax, his mouth opening and closing without any sound emerging. Vivienne stood beside him, her hand still resting on his arm, her triumphant smile from moments before frozen into something brittle and uncertain. "Alina," Alexander finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, though in the complete silence of the ballroom it carried to every corner of the room. "That is not possible." "And yet," Alina said, her voice calm and clear, carrying across the polished floor with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "here I stand." A wave of murmurs broke across the crowd, guests turning to whisper urgently to one another, some pressing gloved hands to their mouths in shock, others simply staring, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. Somewhere near the back of the room, a woman fainted quietly into her husband's arms, though the commotion barely registered against the greater drama playing out at the center of the ballroom. "Forgive my late arrival to my own memorial festivities," Alina continued, allowing the faintest edge of something sharp to color her otherwise steady tone. "I understand a service was already held in my honor. I do hope it was a fitting one." The words landed like a blow, and Alina watched her husband flinch visibly, his face shifting rapidly through shock, confusion, and something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. Vivienne, however, recovered her composure far more quickly than Alexander had, stepping forward slightly, her chin lifting in open challenge. "This is absurd," Vivienne said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom, though a careful listener might have noticed the faint tremor beneath her confident tone. "The Duchess of Ashford is dead. Everyone in this county attended her funeral. This woman is clearly an impostor, taking cruel advantage of a grieving household." A fresh murmur swept through the crowd, some guests nodding uncertainly at Vivienne's words, eager for an explanation that did not require them to fully process what they had just witnessed. Alina felt a flash of cold anger at the accusation, but she held herself steady, refusing to let her composure crack in front of the very people whose good opinion Alexander had always valued so highly. An impostor, Elena repeated slowly, turning her gaze fully upon Vivienne for the first time. How curious that you should be so certain of that, my lady, given that we have met on only a handful of occasions in the 3 years of my marriage. Vivienne's confident expression flickered, just for a moment, before she recovered herself. Any fool can wear a similar gown and paint a scar upon their temple to play upon a grieving family's emotions. Perhaps, Elena said evenly, though I wonder how an impostor might know that the vase upon the entrance hall table was a gift from my father upon my wedding day, or that the portrait of the 3rd Duke of Ashford in the East Gallery hides a small tear along its lower corner, mended so carefully that only a member of this household would ever notice it. A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the nearby guests, several of whom exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their assumptions. Alexander remained silent, his face still pale, his eyes fixed on Elena with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. It was then that a new voice cut through the tense silence of the ballroom, sharp and commanding despite its owner's advanced age. "Let her through." The crowd parted slowly, guests stepping aside to allow passage for a figure making her way forward with the careful, deliberate steps of someone whose joints ached with age, but whose will remained entirely unbroken. Margaret Ashford, the Duke's mother, moved through the crowd with a walking stick in one hand, her sharp eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that silenced the remaining whispers throughout the ballroom. She stopped only a few feet from Elena, studying her face carefully in the candlelight, her gaze moving slowly from the pale scar at Elena's temple to the deep blue gown Elena had once worn to a family dinner years before, back when Margaret had first begun to grow fond of her son's quiet, patient wife. "Elena," Margaret said finally, her voice trembling now, though whether from age or emotion it was impossible to say. "Is it truly you, child?" "It is Mother Ashford," Elena said softly, using the title she had given the old woman in the earliest, kindest days of her marriage, before the distance between herself and Alexander had grown so wide. "I am so sorry to have caused you such grief." Margaret's walking stick clattered to the marble floor as she reached forward with both hands, taking Elena's face gently between her palms, examining her as though committing every feature to memory once again. Tears began to slip down the old woman's lined cheeks, and she pulled Elena into an embrace so fierce that several nearby guests gasped aloud at the sight. "I knew it," Margaret whispered fiercely, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "I knew in my heart something was wrong the moment my son announced this engagement so soon after your funeral. I told him it was unseemly. I told him grief does not vanish in 3 short weeks. And now I understand why my instinct screamed so loudly against it." The embrace between Elena and Margaret, witnessed by hundreds of the county's most prominent families, settled the question of Elena's identity beyond any reasonable doubt. No impostor could have earned such recognition, such open affection, from a woman as sharp and discerning as the Dowager Duchess of Ashford. The murmurs throughout the ballroom shifted now, no longer questioning whether Elena truly was who she claimed to be, but instead turning toward a far more scandalous question entirely. If the Duchess of Ashford was, in fact, alive and well, then what did that mean for the engagement so triumphantly announced only minutes before? Alexander finally seemed to find his voice again, though it emerged strained and uncertain, entirely unlike the confident tone he had used to address the crowd only moments earlier. "Elena, I do not understand. We were told the carriage went into the river. We were told there was no possibility of survival. I saw the wreckage myself." "You saw a wreckage," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning beneath her calm exterior. "And you saw a body wearing my traveling cloak, and you made your assumptions swiftly enough to bury a grieving household's uncertainty beneath a wedding announcement within 3 short weeks." "That is not fair," Alexander began, though his protest sounded weak even to his own ears, judging by the way his voice trailed off before he could finish the thought. "Is it not?" Elena asked quietly. "Tell me, husband, in the weeks since you believed me dead, did you spend a single evening in genuine mourning?" Or did you spend them instead in the company of Lady Vivienne, planning the very celebration we all now stand within? The silence that followed her question told Alina everything she needed to know, more clearly than any words Alexander might have offered in his own defense. She watched the guests around them exchange glances, watched expressions shift from shock into something closer to quiet judgment, and understood that whatever reputation Alexander had carefully built for himself within this county had begun, in this very moment, to crumble beyond any hope of easy repair. Vivienne, sensing the shift in the room's mood, reached for Alexander's arm once again, though her earlier confidence had drained away considerably, replaced by something far more calculating. "This changes nothing," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried only minutes before. "Whatever misunderstanding has occurred, surely it can be resolved privately without further disruption to this evening." "I am afraid," Alina said, turning her gaze fully upon Vivienne once more, "that some misunderstandings, my lady, are not so easily resolved in private, particularly when hundreds of witnesses have already observed them unfold so publicly." The string quartet, uncertain what to do amid the tension gripping the ballroom, remained silent, their instruments lowered, waiting for some signal that never came. The great chandeliers continued to burn steadily overhead, casting their golden light across a room that had, in the space of only a few minutes, transformed from a celebration into something far more dangerous, a stage upon which secrets long hidden had finally begun to spill into the open air. Alina Ashford stood at the center of it all, alive, unharmed, and entirely unwilling to disappear quietly back into the shadows this time. News of what had happened at Ashford Hall spread through the county faster than any carriage could travel, carried on the lips of guests who left the ball that night with stories they would repeat at every dinner table and coach house for weeks to come. By the time Alina woke the following morning, having spent the night in her old bedchamber for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the entire household already understood that everything had changed. She rose slowly, her body still tired from the long journey and the emotional weight of the previous evening, and dressed in a simple gown from her own wardrobe, one of the few small comforts of returning to a place that still held so many of her belongings exactly as she had left them. The room felt strange around her, familiar in every detail yet somehow foreign, as though she were a visitor in a house she had once called home. A soft knock at her door announced Margaret's arrival, the old woman moving slowly with the aid of her walking stick, though her eyes were sharp and clear despite the late hour she had surely kept the night before. "I have not slept a wink," Margaret admitted, settling herself carefully into the chair near Alina's window. "I kept waking to convince myself I had not simply dreamed your return, child. I am relieved to find you still here this morning." "I am still here," Alina confirmed gently, taking a seat across from the old woman. "Though I confess, I hardly know where to begin explaining everything that has happened since the accident." Margaret listened carefully as Alina recounted the full story, from the storm on the cliff road to the loss of Clara, from the fisherman's cottage where she had slowly recovered her memory to the long journey home during which she had learned, piece by painful piece, exactly what her husband had been doing in her supposed absence. Margaret's expression grew darker with each detail, her hands tightening around the head of her walking stick until her knuckles paled. "I sent a letter ahead of me," Alina explained, "the moment I regained enough strength to write clearly. I addressed it to you directly, hoping you might help me understand what had happened before I arrived. I take it from your surprise last night that it never reached you." Margaret's brow furrowed. "I received no such letter, child. Had I known you lived, I would have moved heaven and earth to bring you home immediately, and I certainly would never have allowed my son's engagement ball to proceed as it did." The two women sat in troubled silence for a long moment, both turning over the same uncomfortable question. If Alina's letter had genuinely been sent, and Margaret had genuinely never received it, then someone within Ashford Hall itself had intercepted it, and had done so quite deliberately, for reasons that grew more troubling the longer Alina considered them. A second knock interrupted their conversation, and this time it was Henry, the household's longtime butler, who entered with visible discomfort written across his usually composed features. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Alina with careful formality, "the Duke requests a private audience with you at your earliest convenience. He is waiting in the study." Alina exchanged a glance with Margaret, who nodded slowly, understanding without needing to be told that this conversation was one Alina needed to face on her own. Alina rose, smoothed her gown, and followed Henry down the familiar corridors of Ashford Hall toward the study where she had spent so many quiet hours managing the estate's accounts during the years of her marriage. Alexander stood near the window when she entered, his back to the door, his shoulders tense beneath his fine morning coat. He turned slowly as Henry closed the door behind her, and Alina was struck by how tired he looked, the confident smile from the ballroom entirely absent, replaced by something closer to genuine distress. "I hardly know how to begin," he admitted quietly, gesturing for her to sit, though Alina remained standing near the door, unwilling to settle into a comfortable chair for what she suspected would be an uncomfortable conversation. "Perhaps begin with an explanation of the letter that never reached your mother," Alina suggested, her voice level but firm. Alexander's expression shifted into genuine confusion. "What letter?" Alina studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of deception, and found, to her own surprise, that his confusion appeared entirely genuine. Whatever else Alexander Ashford might be guilty of, it seemed increasingly clear that he had not personally intercepted her letter, which meant someone else within the household bore responsibility for that particular cruelty. "It does not matter for now," Alina said, filing the thought away for later consideration. "Tell me instead why you moved to announce an engagement only 3 weeks after believing me dead, Alexander. Even accounting for whatever feelings you may hold for Lady Vivienne, such haste seems remarkable, even for a man eager to remarry." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the carpet beneath his feet. "The estate's finances have grown more precarious than you know, Alina. Vivienne's family holds considerable wealth, and she made clear that any delay in our engagement might allow her family to reconsider the match entirely. I acted, I confess, with more haste than wisdom." "You mean to say," Alina said slowly, her voice growing colder with each word, "that you saw an opportunity in my supposed death, and moved swiftly to secure both a new marriage and a solution to your financial troubles, before proper grief could even be observed?" Alexander did not answer, which told Alina everything she needed to know regardless of whatever careful words he might have chosen instead. It was then that a thought, cold and sharp, occurred to Alina with sudden clarity. She had signed a marriage settlement upon her wedding day, drafted by lawyers she had trusted entirely to her father's judgment, and though she had never studied its precise language closely, she understood the general shape of such arrangements well enough. Her father's fortune, considerable in its own right, would have transferred entirely into Alexander's possession upon her death, freeing him not only to remarry, but to remarry with access to resources that might otherwise have remained under Alina's own control throughout her lifetime. "Alexander," she said slowly, "what does my marriage settlement say regarding the disposition of my father's fortune should I die before you?" His face paled slightly at the question, and his hesitation before answering told Alina everything she needed to know. "The full amount would pass to me," he admitted quietly, "as is customary in such arrangements." Alina said nothing for a long moment, allowing the weight of that admission to settle fully between them. A dead wife would have secured not only Alexander's freedom to remarry, but immediate access to the very fortune that had saved his family's estate from ruin years before. The timing of the engagement, the haste of the entire affair, suddenly made a far more troubling kind of sense. "I did not arrange the accident, Alina," Alexander said quickly, seeming to read the direction of her thoughts written plainly across her face. "Whatever you may be thinking now, I swear to you I had no part in whatever happened on that cliff road." "Perhaps not," Alina said carefully, though the seed of doubt had already taken root in her mind, refusing to be easily dismissed. "Though I find myself wondering, now more than ever, exactly what did happen on that cliff road, and whether the storm alone was truly responsible for what befell my carriage. The conversation that followed grew increasingly tense, with Alexander alternating between genuine shame at his own hasty conduct and clumsy attempts to justify decisions that grew harder to defend the longer Alina pressed him on the details. He begged her, eventually, to consider how any public scandal might affect not only his own reputation, but the security of the entire household, including his mother, whose comfortable final years depended entirely upon the estate's continued stability. "I will not pretend this marriage has been a happy one," Alina said finally, her patience wearing thin after nearly an hour of careful, circling conversation. "But I will also not be pushed aside a second time simply because my continued presence proves inconvenient to your plans. I intend to remain at Ashford Hall, Alexander, and I intend to understand fully what happened to my carriage on that cliff road, and who exactly stood to benefit most from my death." Alexander's face grew pale at the implication carried within her words, though he offered no further protest as Alina turned and left the study, her steps steady and unhurried despite the storm of emotion churning beneath her calm exterior. Behind her, in the ballroom below, servants had already begun the quiet work of removing the last traces of the previous night's celebration, the flowers wilting now in their careful arrangements, the candles burned down to uneven stubs, the whole grand display of a betrothal celebration transformed overnight into something closer to evidence in a mystery that had only just begun to unravel. Alina climbed the stairs slowly, her mind already turning toward the practical matters that lay ahead. She would need to speak with a solicitor regarding her marriage settlement. She would need to discover who exactly had intercepted her letter to Margaret. And she would need, more urgently than either of those tasks, to understand precisely what had caused her carriage to lose the road on that terrible stormy night, and whether the answer to that question pointed toward simple misfortune, or toward something far more deliberate and far more dangerous than she had allowed herself to consider until this very morning. Word of the previous evening's events reached the offices of Whitmore and Associates before Alina herself did, carried by a client who had attended the ball and could speak of little else that morning. Nathaniel Gray, junior partner in the firm that had long handled the Ashford family's legal affairs, listened to the account with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with idle curiosity, and everything to do with a nagging discomfort he had carried for weeks without quite understanding why. Nathaniel had reviewed the paperwork surrounding the Duchess of Ashford's death shortly after the accident, a routine matter given his firm's long association with the family, and something about the circumstances had struck him as odd even then, though he had been unable to articulate precisely what troubled him at the time: the speed with which the funeral had been arranged. The reluctance of certain household staff to speak plainly about the accident when he had asked routine questions during his review. The convenient timing of an engagement announcement that had followed so swiftly upon a tragedy that should have demanded far more time for proper mourning. When Alina arrived at his office 2 days after the ball, having sent ahead a brief note requesting a private consultation regarding her marriage settlement, Nathaniel found himself facing a woman entirely unlike the grieving widow he had half expected to meet. She sat across from his desk with quiet composure, the thin scar at her temple the only visible reminder of the ordeal she had survived, and answered his careful questions with a clarity that told him immediately she had already begun piecing together a picture far more troubling than a simple carriage accident. "I would like to understand precisely what my marriage settlement allows, and what protections might exist for securing my own fortune independently of my husband's control," Alina explained, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the gravity of what she was asking. Nathaniel spent the better part of an hour walking her carefully through the language of the original settlement, explaining how a trust might be established to place her father's fortune beyond her husband's reach entirely, protecting it not only from any future claims Alexander might attempt, but from any similar circumstances that might arise again in the future. Alina listened intently, asking sharp, well-considered questions that revealed a mind far more capable than most solicitors expected from clients of her station. "There is something else," Nathaniel said finally, once the practical matters had been thoroughly addressed, "that I believe you should know, Your Grace, though I confess I have hesitated to raise it given the sensitivity of the circumstances." Aliner's attention sharpened immediately. "Please speak plainly." "When I reviewed the paperwork following your reported death," Nathaniel explained carefully, "I noted certain irregularities that troubled me at the time, though I had no reason then to suspect anything beyond simple administrative haste. The carriage wreckage was cleared from the riverbank remarkably quickly, before any thorough examination could be conducted. And when I inquired with the stable staff regarding the carriage's recent maintenance, I received answers that struck me as evasive rather than forthcoming." Aliner leaned forward slightly, her earlier composure giving way to sharp, focused attention. "What kind of irregularities?" "The carriage axle," Nathaniel said carefully, "according to the stable master's own records, had been inspected and found sound only 2 days before your journey began. Yet the wreckage, from what little I was able to examine before it was cleared away, suggested a failure at precisely that point, a failure that seemed, to my admittedly untrained eye, somewhat inconsistent with simple wear or storm damage alone." A cold weight settled into Aliner's chest as she absorbed the implication of his words. "Are you suggesting the carriage was deliberately tampered with?" "I am suggesting only that the circumstances warrant closer examination than they received at the time," Nathaniel said carefully, though his tone made clear he shared her growing suspicion far more than his measured words admitted. "I made note of my concerns in my private records, though I did not pursue the matter further, given that the household appeared satisfied the accident had been a simple consequence of the storm, and I had no standing to insist upon further investigation." Aliner sat in troubled silence for a long moment, turning over the implications of what Nathaniel had shared. If the carriage had genuinely been tampered with, then her accident on the cliff road had not been simple misfortune at all, but a deliberate act intended to end her life, and Clara's death, tragic as it already was, became something far darker than an accident of terrible timing. "Who had access to the carriage in the days before my journey?" Aliner asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning beneath her calm exterior. "That, Your Grace," Nathaniel said gravely, "is precisely the question I believe deserves careful answering." Over the following days, Aliner found herself drawn into a quiet, careful investigation that ran parallel to the more practical matters of securing her fortune and re-establishing her position within Ashford Hall's household. She spoke privately with the stable staff, gently probing for details about who had visited the stables in the days before her fateful journey. She reviewed the household's guest records, cross-referencing visitors against the timeline Nathaniel had helped her construct. And slowly, methodically, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Vivienne Sinclair, it turned out, had visited Ashford Hall on no fewer than 3 occasions in the 2 weeks before Aliner's journey to the coast house. Each visit arranged discreetly, while Alexander attended to business in the city. Each visit lasting long enough to raise questions Aliner had never thought to ask before her own supposed death had forced her to look more closely at the household's recent history. More troubling still, a young stable hand, nervous and reluctant to speak at first, eventually admitted under Aliner's gentle but persistent questioning that Lady Vivienne had once asked him, seemingly in idle curiosity, about the particulars of carriage maintenance, and had spent an unusual amount of time examining the very carriage Aliner had later taken on her ill-fated journey, during one of her visits while the household staff attended to other duties. Aliner also learned, through careful conversation with Henry, the longtime butler whose loyalty to the family ran deeper than his loyalty to any single member of it, that a young housemaid named Charlotte had been dismissed rather abruptly in the days following Aliner's departure, with little explanation given beyond vague references to unspecified misconduct. When Aliner located the girl, now working in a neighboring household, and gently pressed her for the truth of her dismissal, Charlotte broke down in tears, admitting that she had been paid a substantial sum by Lady Vivienne to intercept and destroy any correspondence addressed to Margaret Ashford that arrived at the house during a specific window of weeks. Correspondence Vivienne had claimed, falsely, contained sensitive family matters that needed careful handling. The pieces, slowly and painfully, began to form a picture Alina had not wanted to see clearly until the evidence left her no other honest choice. Vivienne Sinclair had not simply taken advantage of a tragic accident to advance her own ambitions. She had, it seemed increasingly likely, created the circumstances of that accident herself, and had then moved swiftly and ruthlessly to ensure that any evidence of Alina's survival remained hidden from the one person in the household who might have acted upon it immediately. Alina brought her findings to Nathaniel's office once again, laying out the full picture she had assembled with careful, methodical precision. Nathaniel listened gravely, occasionally asking sharp, clarifying questions that helped strengthen the evidence into something closer to an undeniable case, rather than a collection of troubling coincidences. "This is serious enough to warrant formal investigation," Nathaniel said finally, once Alina had finished. "Attempted harm against a person of your standing, your grace, particularly when it resulted in the tragic loss of your maid's life, is a matter no magistrate could ignore, once presented with evidence of this weight." "I know," Alina said quietly, though a part of her still recoiled from the enormity of what she was contemplating. Bringing formal charges against Vivienne would mean a scandal far greater than anything the county had yet witnessed, would mean dragging Alexander's name and the Ashford family's reputation through consequences that would follow them for years to come. "There is another consideration," Nathaniel added carefully, watching her expression closely. "If Lady Vivienne acted alone in this matter, without your husband's knowledge or involvement, then the Duke himself bears no legal culpability for what happened to you, whatever moral failings his own conduct might otherwise reveal. But if there is any indication he knew or suspected, and chose to proceed with the engagement regardless." He did not finish the thought, though Alina understood its implication clearly enough. The question of Alexander's own guilt, separate from whatever role Vivienne had played, remained an open and troubling one, and Alina found she could not yet answer it with any real certainty, despite everything she had learned in the days since her return. She left Nathaniel's office that afternoon carrying a weight of knowledge that felt almost unbearable, torn between the desire for justice on Clara's behalf and a growing awareness that whatever path she chose next would reshape not only her own future, but the futures of everyone connected to the tangled web of ambition, deception, and quiet cruelty that had nearly ended her life on a storm-battered cliff road weeks before. As her carriage rolled slowly back toward Ashford Hall through the golden light of early evening, Alina found her thoughts returning, unexpectedly, to Nathaniel Gray himself, to the careful, steady manner in which he had approached each troubling revelation, to the genuine concern that had colored his voice when he spoke of the danger she had survived. It had been a very long time, she realized with quiet surprise, since anyone had looked at her with such honest, uncomplicated regard, entirely free of the calculation and self-interest that had defined so much of her marriage. It was a small thing, perhaps, amid the far larger questions now consuming her attention, but Alina found she could not entirely dismiss it from her mind as the carriage carried her homeward through the gathering dusk. Alina spent the following weeks moving with a careful, deliberate patience that surprised even herself, choosing her steps as carefully as a person crossing a frozen pond, aware that any misstep might shatter the fragile ice beneath her feet before she had gathered everything she needed. She did not confront Vivienne directly, not yet, understanding that a woman clever enough to arrange an accident and intercept correspondence so effectively would not be easily cornered without overwhelming evidence prepared well in advance. Instead, Alina worked quietly alongside Nathaniel Gray, meeting with him regularly under the reasonable pretense of finalizing the trust arrangement for her father's fortune, though their conversations increasingly turned toward the mounting evidence against Vivienne and the careful strategy required to bring it fully into the light. Margaret proved an unexpected ally in these efforts, her sharp mind and decades of experience navigating the county's social circles proving invaluable as Alina sought to understand Vivienne's full history and the true extent of her ambitions. Over quiet afternoon teas, Margaret shared stories of Vivienne's past that painted a picture far more calculating than the charming widow most of society believed her to be. "She was engaged once before, you know," Margaret confided one afternoon, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "To a young lord from the northern counties, a decade or more ago now. The engagement ended rather suddenly when the young man's family fortune was discovered to be considerably smaller than initially believed. Vivienne broke it off within the week and married Lord Sinclair not 3 months later, a man twice her age with considerably deeper pockets." Alina absorbed this information carefully, adding it to the growing picture of a woman who had spent years pursuing wealth and position with a single-minded determination that had, it seemed, finally led her toward far more dangerous territory than a simple broken engagement. Charlotte, the dismissed housemaid, agreed to provide a formal written statement regarding the payment she had received from Vivienne to intercept Alina's correspondence, though she remained frightened of any consequences that might follow such an admission. Alina arranged, through Nathaniel's careful guidance, for the girl to receive both protection and fair compensation for her honesty, understanding that justice would require more courage from ordinary people than most were accustomed to offering. The stable hand, too, eventually agreed to provide a formal account of Vivienne's suspicious interest in the carriage's mechanisms, though his testimony alone proved less conclusive than Alina had hoped, given that he could not swear with absolute certainty that Vivienne had actually tampered with anything during her examination of the vehicle. It was Nathaniel who eventually suggested the piece of evidence that would prove most damning of all. "Lady Vivienne is not a woman who trusts easily," he observed during one of their strategy sessions, held in the quiet privacy of his office late one evening. "Women who plan so carefully rarely leave matters entirely to chance, or entirely to the discretion of servants they have paid for silence. I suspect she may have kept some record of her arrangements, whether from an excess of caution or simple habit." Alina considered this carefully. "You believe she may have written something down?" "I believe," Nathaniel said carefully, "that a woman clever enough to orchestrate everything we have already uncovered would also be clever enough to protect herself, should any of her accomplices ever attempt to turn against her with false accusations. A written record, carefully hidden, would serve as both insurance and leverage, should she ever need either." The theory proved difficult to test without access to Vivienne's private residence, a challenge that occupied Alina's thoughts for several restless nights, until an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Margaret, through her extensive social connections, learned that Vivienne planned to host a small gathering at her own townhouse the following week, an event that would draw most of her household staff into service for the evening, leaving her private study largely unattended during the hours of the party itself. Alina did not attend the gathering herself, understanding that her presence would draw far too much attention given the events of the ball weeks before. Instead, she relied upon a discreet arrangement made through Nathaniel, who knew a private investigator with experience in matters requiring both careful timing and absolute discretion. The man, whose name Alina never learned and preferred not to know, entered Vivienne's townhouse during the height of the evening's festivities and located within her private study a locked drawer that yielded, upon careful examination, a small collection of letters and notes that told a story far more damning than Alina had even dared to hope. Among the papers was a letter, unsent, and evidently drafted as a private record rather than genuine correspondence, in which Vivienne had written candidly to herself about the frustrations of watching Alexander remain bound to a wife who showed no signs of dying conveniently on her own. Another note, dated shortly before Alina's fateful journey, referenced a payment made to a person, identified only by initials, for services described vaguely as ensuring a journey proceeded according to plan. The evidence, while not an explicit confession of tampering with the carriage itself, painted a picture clear enough that even the most skeptical magistrate would struggle to dismiss it as mere coincidence, particularly when combined with Charlotte's testimony regarding the intercepted letters and the stable hand's account of Vivienne's suspicious interest in the carriage's mechanisms. Alina sat with Nathaniel late one evening, reviewing the full collection of evidence spread across his desk, and felt the weight of the decision now facing her settle heavily upon her shoulders. She could bring this evidence forward publicly, ensuring Vivienne faced the full consequences of her actions through formal legal proceedings, a path that would guarantee justice for Clara, but would also expose the Ashford family to scandal of an entirely different magnitude than anything they had already weathered. Or she could choose a quieter path, one that would see Vivienne quietly but thoroughly ruined within society's circles, her reputation destroyed through careful, deliberate revelation to exactly the right people, without ever requiring the full, ugly truth to become a matter of public court records that would follow the Ashford name for generations to come. "What would you choose?" Alina asked Nathaniel quietly, "if the decision were yours alone to make?" Nathaniel considered the question carefully before answering, his expression thoughtful in the candlelight of his quiet office. "I would choose whichever path allows you to sleep soundly at night, Your Grace. Justice matters, certainly, and Clara deserves to have her death properly acknowledged rather than dismissed as simple misfortune. But you have already survived a great deal. You should not feel obligated to sacrifice your own peace entirely in pursuit of a justice that society may never fully deliver regardless of how much evidence you present." Alina appreciated the honesty of his answer, and found herself, in the days that followed, drawn increasingly toward a path that would honor Clara's memory, while also protecting her own hard-won freedom from the exhausting spectacle of a public trial. She met privately with several of the county's most influential matrons, women whose opinions shaped society's judgments far more effectively than any court proceeding might accomplish, and shared with them, carefully and selectively, enough of the evidence to make Vivienne's guilt undeniable within their circles. The effect was swift and merciless. Within a fortnight, invitations to Vivienne's gatherings dwindled to almost nothing. Doors that had once opened eagerly for the charming widow now remained firmly closed. Whispers of her role in the carriage accident spread through drawing rooms and dinner parties with the same efficiency that had once carried gossip about Alina's own supposed death, until Vivienne found herself, within a matter of weeks, an outcast within the very society she had spent years so carefully cultivating. Alexander, for his part, ended his engagement to Vivienne quietly, offering no public explanation beyond vague references to circumstances that made the match no longer suitable, though anyone paying close attention understood well enough what had truly transpired. He approached Alina once, in the final days before Vivienne's complete social ruin became apparent to all, attempting some clumsy apology for his role in the whole painful affair, though Alina found she had little patience left for his belated remorse. "You did not arrange for the carriage to fail," Alina told him plainly, standing in the same study where their difficult first conversation had taken place weeks before. "But you moved with such haste to remarry that you gave a dangerous woman every reason to believe her actions had succeeded exactly as planned, and every reason to believe she would face no consequences for what she had done. That failure of judgment belongs entirely to you, Alexander, whatever else may be laid at Vivienne's feet." He had no answer for that, and Alina found, standing there in the fading afternoon light, that she felt no satisfaction in his silence, only a quiet, tired certainty that whatever remained of their marriage had already ended, long before the storm on the cliff road had ever given her the chance to see it so clearly. The final piece of the truth arrived not through Alina's careful investigation, but through Vivienne herself, who, faced with complete social ruin and no remaining allies willing to defend her reputation, made the decision to leave the country entirely rather than endure any further humiliation within a society that had so thoroughly turned against her. Before her departure, however, Vivienne did something Alina had not anticipated. She wrote a letter, addressed directly to Alina, and delivered by a messenger who refused to identify himself before disappearing quickly into the evening streets. Alina opened the letter alone in her private sitting room, her hands steady despite the uncertainty of what she might find within its pages. The letter contained what could only be described as a confession, written in Vivienne's own careful hand, though couched in language that stopped just short of outright admission, as though Vivienne could not quite bring herself to state the truth plainly even in what amounted to her final communication before fleeing the country entirely. She wrote of desperation, of years spent watching Alexander remain tied to a marriage that offered him nothing but obligation, of a moment of weakness in which she had arranged for a stable hand of questionable character to weaken the carriage's axle just enough to ensure trouble on a difficult road, never intending, she claimed, for anyone to actually lose their life in the process. She expressed what Alina read as genuine, if belated, remorse for Clara's death, though the words felt hollow given everything that had followed, given the careful, calculated haste with which Vivienne had moved to secure her engagement the very moment she believed her plan had succeeded. Alina brought the letter to Nathaniel the following morning, and together they made the decision to forward a copy to the county magistrate, along with the full collection of evidence they had already gathered, ensuring that whatever became of Vivienne in whatever distant country she had fled toward, a formal record would exist documenting exactly what had happened on that stormy cliff road weeks before. The magistrate, presented with such thorough documentation, issued a formal warrant for Vivienne's arrest should she ever return to English soil, though everyone involved understood that a woman with Vivienne's resources and connections might well avoid such consequences for years, or perhaps forever. It was not the complete justice Alina had once imagined pursuing, but it was, she found, enough. Clara's death had been properly acknowledged, formally recorded as the result of deliberate harm rather than simple accident, and her family, whom Alina visited personally to share the truth, received both a formal apology and a generous settlement that Alina arranged from her own newly protected fortune, ensuring that Clara's younger siblings would want for nothing in the years ahead. Alexander, faced with the full scandal of his broken engagement, and the public knowledge of his own poor judgment in the weeks following Alina's supposed death, found his standing within society considerably diminished, though he retained enough of his title and remaining resources to continue managing the estate, albeit under far more modest circumstances than he had once enjoyed. Alina, for her part, negotiated a quiet legal separation with the assistance of Nathaniel's careful counsel, an arrangement that allowed her to maintain her own household and independence while avoiding the greater scandal and complication that a full divorce would have entailed, particularly given the criminal proceedings already surrounding Vivienne's actions. Margaret chose, in the end, to remain at Ashford Hall with her son, though she made clear to Alina, in a tearful private conversation shortly before Alina's departure, that her affection for her daughter-in-law had never wavered, and never would, regardless of whatever legal arrangements now separated their households. "You will always have a place here, child, whenever you wish to visit," Margaret told her, gripping Alina's hands tightly. "You gave me more genuine kindness in 3 years than my own son has managed in his entire life. I will not forget that, whatever else changes between us now." Alina established herself in a modest but comfortable house on the edge of the county, using a portion of her secured fortune to create a life entirely her own for the first time since her wedding day years before. She found, in the months that followed, a freedom she had never expected to experience, freedom to manage her own affairs without the constant weight of a marriage that had brought her far more loneliness than companionship. Nathaniel Gray continued to serve as her solicitor throughout the practical matters of establishing her independent household, and their professional relationship, over the course of many months, slowly deepened into something warmer, something neither of them rushed or forced, but allowed to grow naturally through countless quiet conversations, shared meals, and the simple, steady comfort of a genuine friendship built on mutual respect rather than convenience or obligation. He never once made her feel as though her survival, her resilience, or her hard-won independence were qualities to be tempered or hidden away for the comfort of those around her. He listened when she spoke of Clara, understanding without needing lengthy explanation why she still visited the young woman's grave regularly, now properly marked with her own name rather than Aliner's. He respected the boundaries she had carefully established for herself after years of feeling unseen within her own marriage, never pressing for more than she was ready to offer. A full year after the night Aliner had walked into her own ballroom, alive and unbowed, she found herself once again preparing for an evening at a grand estate, though this time the circumstances could not have been more different. Nathaniel had been invited to a formal gathering hosted by a colleague within the county's legal circles, and had asked Aliner, with careful, genuine hope rather than expectation, whether she might consider attending as his companion for the evening. Aliner dressed that evening in a gown of deep gold silk, entirely new, chosen for herself rather than to please anyone else's expectations, and arranged her hair in a style she genuinely liked rather than one dictated by fashion or obligation. She examined the thin scar at her temple in her mirror, faded now but still visible, and felt no urge to hide it any longer, understanding it as a permanent reminder of everything she had survived and everything she had reclaimed in the year since. The ballroom that evening glowed with warm candlelight, filled with music and laughter that felt, this time, entirely genuine rather than hollow, and as Aliner entered on Nathaniel's arm, she felt none of the fear or grief that had once accompanied her into a similar room a year before. Heads turned as she entered, certainly, whispers followed in her wake as they always seemed to now, given everything the county had witnessed and gradually learned about her extraordinary story. But the whispers had changed their character entirely over the past year. She was no longer spoken of as the dead Duchess, or the tragic victim of a storm and a husband's careless haste. She had become, instead, something far more remarkable in the eyes of a county that had watched her survive, investigate, and ultimately triumph over circumstances that would have broken far weaker resolve. She was spoken of now as the woman who had walked back into her own life, who had refused to remain silent, who had secured justice for a faithful servant and independence for herself, all while maintaining a grace and dignity that even her harshest critics found impossible to deny. Aliner moved through the crowd that evening with Nathaniel steady beside her, exchanging warm greetings with familiar faces, accepting genuine congratulations on the establishment of her independent household, and feeling, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, entirely and completely herself. She thought briefly of the frightened young woman who had once believed love could be built slowly, one careful stone at a time, upon a foundation of obligation and quiet endurance. That woman had drowned, in a sense, on the storm-battered cliff road a year before, swept away by the same river that had claimed poor Clara's life so tragically. But something new had emerged from those cold waters, something stronger and clearer than the woman who had entered that river. And as the music swelled around her and Nathaniel's hand found hers gently amid the dancing crowd, Aliner understood, with quiet and complete certainty, that she had not merely survived her own supposed death. She had, in every meaningful sense, been given the rare and extraordinary chance to begin again. 2 years after the night she had walked alive into her own memorial ball, Aliner received a letter that carried her thoughts back, briefly, to the storm that had once nearly ended her life. The letter came from a magistrate in a distant coastal town, informing her that a woman matching Vivienne Sinclair's description had been located abroad, living under an assumed name, and had been quietly taken into custody following an unrelated matter that had drawn the attention of local authorities. The formal warrant issued years before had finally, unexpectedly, found its purpose. Aliner read the letter twice, sitting alone in the small study of her own comfortable house, and found that the news, which she had once imagined might bring her a fierce and satisfying sense of closure, instead settled over her with a quiet, measured calm. She had already built the life she wanted. She had already secured justice for Clara in every way that had truly mattered to her. Whatever consequences Vivienne now faced in a distant courtroom felt, in the end, like the closing of a door on a chapter Aliner had long since finished reading. She wrote a brief letter to Clara's family that same afternoon, sharing the news gently, understanding that they, more than anyone, deserved to know that the woman responsible for their daughter's death would finally answer for her actions before proper authorities. Clara's mother wrote back within the week, expressing gratitude not for the arrest itself, but for Aliner's continued kindness in the years since. For the settlement that had allowed Clara's younger sister to pursue an education Clara herself had never had the opportunity to receive, and for the simple dignity of having Clara's true name restored to her grave, visited faithfully by the woman she had once served so loyally. Margaret Ashford, now well into her 70s but still remarkably sharp, continued to welcome Aliner warmly whenever she visited Ashford Hall, their bond having grown, if anything, even stronger in the years since the scandal that had once threatened to tear the family apart entirely. Alexander, for his part, had grown quieter and more thoughtful in the years following his broken engagement, devoting himself with unexpected diligence to properly managing what remained of the estate, having learned, at considerable cost, the value of patience and genuine reflection that his earlier years had so clearly lacked. He and Aliner maintained a civil, if distant, relationship, meeting occasionally to discuss matters concerning Margaret's care or the tenants whose welfare Aliner still quietly monitored out of old habit and genuine affection for the people who had once depended upon her stewardship. Aliner and Nathaniel married in a small, quiet ceremony attended only by those closest to them, held not at Ashford Hall, but in the modest chapel nearest Aliner's own home, a place that held no painful memories, only the promise of a future built on honesty rather than obligation. Margaret attended, seated proudly near the front, dabbing at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony and declaring afterward, to anyone who would listen, that she had gained not one but two children she genuinely loved through the strange and winding path fate had carved for Aliner. Nathaniel's legal practice continued to flourish in the years that followed, and he often remarked, with quiet affection, that Aliner possessed a sharper mind for uncovering hidden truths than most solicitors he had trained alongside, a skill she occasionally lent to his practice when particularly difficult matters required careful, patient investigation. Aliner, for her part, found deep satisfaction in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built entirely on her own terms, managing her own household, maintaining her own friendships, and raising, in time, a small family with a man who had never once asked her to become smaller or quieter than she truly was. She kept always a small portrait of Clara in her private sitting room, a simple sketch commissioned from a local artist based on Aliner's own careful description, a quiet reminder of the price that had been paid for the freedom and clarity Aliner had eventually found. She visited the churchyard regularly, tending to the grave with her own hands, and often brought her children along in later years, teaching them gently about loyalty, courage, and the importance of speaking truth even when silence would prove far easier. On quiet evenings, when the fire burned low in her sitting room and Nathaniel sat reading nearby, Aliner sometimes found her thoughts drifting back to that terrible night on the cliff road, to the cold water closing over her head, to the moment she had truly believed her life was ending. She no longer felt fear when she remembered it, only a quiet, steady gratitude for the strange and painful path that had led her, eventually, to a life far richer and more honest than the one she had once believed herself destined to accept. The county still spoke of her story occasionally, particularly to newcomers unfamiliar with the remarkable tale, the story of the Duchess who had walked alive into her own memorial ball, who had uncovered a plot against her own life, who had secured justice through patience and careful resolve rather than public spectacle, and who had, in the end, built an entirely new life from the wreckage of an old one that had never truly served her. Aliner never minded the retelling. She understood better than most that some stories deserved to be remembered, not for their drama or scandal, but for the quiet, essential truth they carried at their core. A woman had been declared dead, had heard her own husband announce her passing to a room full of strangers, and had chosen, in the face of that impossible moment, not to remain a ghost within her own life, but to walk forward, fully alive, into whatever truth awaited her. And in every version of the story told throughout the county in the years that followed, That single truth remained unchanged, carried forward by everyone who had witnessed it or heard it told. Alina Ashford had not simply survived the river that tried to claim her. She had risen from it, entirely and unmistakably alive, and had never once looked back toward the woman she had been before that stormy night changed everything.